Hey guys, today I have my 10th Women's Prize review for this year. We're getting there. That 10th book is A Boy in Winter by Rachel Seiffert. This is the third time she's been longlisted for the Women's Prize, and she's also been shortlisted for the Booker in the past. This novel is set over 3 days in 1941 in a small Ukrainian town that was recently held by the Russians, but has been taken over by the Germans. And over the course of these days, all the Jews in the surrounding area are rounded up and taken to a local brick factory. This was well before the events of the Holocaust were common knowledge, although already there were whispers. And we follow three main character threads: a German engineer, a Jewish family, and a country girl who comes across two boys on the run. This is a very quiet book. Nothing flashy happens, nothing is too stylized. Seiffert is only focused on giving you sketches of these people's lives as they transition from one type of war to another. This uneasy pocket of time when unknowingly they were on the precipice of a new type of loss. And she does this to downplay the sense of history and drama attached to these events, because for the people experiencing them, they don't know they're part of a larger narrative. They're just making decisions hour by hour, and they don't fully understand the consequences of those decisions. Basically, it's a Holocaust and World War II book that barely feels like a Holocaust or World War II book, and to a certain extent I liked that about it. When I think back on this, there are a few details that stand out. One perspective is from a man named Ephraim who decides to obey the German summons to meet in the local factory. And they're told in that summons to pack one suitcase of belongings, winter clothing, food for 3 days' travel. And Ephraim also decides to bring his optician's tools, salvaged from his small practice rooms, careful, as he always was, wrapping his pliers, his screwdrivers, and his calipers for the journey, stooping over his workbench to select the best of his lenses and the best soft leather to protect them. I've been to Auschwitz and I've seen the suitcases, and you know that those people were told to write their names on the suitcases so that they'd feel reassured that they'd be reunited with their belongings. But that's still retrospective thinking. This moment with Ephraim carefully packing his lenses is so filled with pathos, because the reader understands that whatever's going to happen to him isn't going to involve setting up a new optician's practice, but we're witnessing his thought process in the moment. The Germans told them to pack. Why would they need to pack for a future if anything terrible were going to happen to them? And Ephraim is unsure of the future, but he's hedging his bets that obeying is the safest thing for his family. The storyline with the German engineer Otto Pol is the most resonant metaphorically, because his job is to supervise the construction of a road through Ukraine. But the land is intractable. It's devilish to build anything solid on these marshes. So Pol has to bring all of his skill and ingenuity to bear to make this happen in the service of the Reich, because the Reich sees this road in a practical light, but also a symbolic one, imposing its iron will and progress on this unruly backwards country and the unruly people who live there. But even when this road is built and stretches gloriously all the way to Russia, by the way, how'd that work out in the end? The land endures. Sure, this road cuts through it, but it's a tiny ribbon, like a blip, compared to the marshes. Now, it would have been nice if Pol himself had been more fully realized. We do get glimpses of his home life, but ultimately he's one of the weaker parts of the story. And all of this road symbolism is a little bit on the nose, but it fits with the historical record, and I think Seiffert handles it well. The other aspect that surprised me is the emphasis on local hierarchies, because for outsiders, it's tempting to only separate these characters into Christians and Jews. But of course, for these characters, things are a lot more complicated than that. One of the main figures is a girl named Yasia, who's from the countryside, and when she goes into town, she's hyper aware of how the townspeople view her. A further distinction is made between people like Yasia and actual marsh dwellers who have their own hierarchies and culture. Most of the Jewish people live in town, but they're viewed as distinct. And then things are further complicated by the recent presence of the Russians and the resentments between people who suffered under Russian occupation and those who benefited. All of these social realities are presented very naturally, and they eventually lead to questions of how much you can change your identity in such a rigid social structure, and if changing your identity is a privilege or an erasure of some sort. So I liked a lot of the choices Seiffert made, but I think this book strays too much from quiet to muted. And partly that's because two of the major scenes end up being some of the least effective. So I can't get into specifics because I'm avoiding spoilers, but the key scene is written in a way that's quite mechanical and detached. And that could have been successful, but it's also confusing, and the more logistical descriptions Seiffert included, the less I could actually picture the logistics. And the narrative relies so much on the emotional impact of this scene that when it doesn't deliver, you can almost feel the whole book deflate around it. Then there's another moment where several main characters run into one another. And it's also kind of confusing and such a throwaway scene in the end. Like literally you could cut it from the book and it wouldn't change anything plot-wise or emotionally, which isn't really something you want to say about a moment when storylines converge. I guess my main question when I closed this was, what is this book's hook? It's not the sentence by sentence writing, which is fine, but pretty straightforward, not of the linguistic candy variety. It's not the plot, there's barely any of that. It's not the characters, we only get rough sketches of who they are as individuals. And it has atmospheric moments, especially towards the end when the marshes become more prominent. But it's not an especially atmospheric book either. So what is it attempting? Why tell this story now? It's interesting in theory, but it never feels urgent or immediate. And considering that we live in an age of embarrassing riches when it comes to books, more options and more quality options than any humans who have ever lived, I'm hard-pressed to say what would recommend this one over any others. Basically, if you have a World War II itch that you'd like to scratch with something that isn't terribly bloody or depressing or epic, or if you're interested in the experience of Ukrainians during the war, then read this. The Ukraine setting was what interested me originally. And if you do end up giving this novel a try, I suggest reading it in large chunks because it is so subtle that it's hard to get into again and again. Otherwise, you can probably skip it. I mean, I love curling up with a quiet book, but I honestly think that I'll look back on my Goodreads shelf at the end of the year and be like, oh yeah, that was a book I read. Let me know what you think of A Boy in Winter if you've read it or are planning on reading it, and I'll see you soon for another video. Bye guys. Thanks for watching.